Hey everybody, this is Dahlia, and welcome to my second tutorial. The topic of this one is how to fix your custom content doors and windows, which were unfortunately wrecked in the September 2020 patch. Now, this will become obsolete, of course, once the batch fix from Sims 4 Studio is released, and you can just use one click to do everything we're going to do in this video. But in the meantime, I've been tinkering a lot with this and figured out a method that I think is quite effective and efficient, and hopefully you'll realize that it's actually super easy to do yourself. Once you get your head around some of the basic concepts and what's what, you can apply the principles to all manner of shapes and sizes, and you will hopefully have the confidence to give it a try yourself. So bear with me, it's a relatively long video because we've got a lot to cover, but I'll try to take you through as efficiently as possible. Before we launch into the nitty-gritty, I thought I might just show you a tutorial that I found really helpful. This is from Ciboulette on Sims 4 Studio. She has given a really comprehensive and detailed explanation about how she goes through with Blender and finds the coordinates, and then how she inputs them. It's basically the same thing that I do, although I do a slightly different thing in Blender, which you'll see. And I think it's a really helpful information to have referenced in written form. The reason I made this video was because I thought it might be helpful for people who aren't really as into reading something but actually want to see it done. Hopefully between this and the written tutorials, it'll really bring the concepts to life, because like I said, it's a paradigm shift. It's been really different for the whole community. So also wanted to show you this post by SimGuy80 all the way back in September. He was the first person to sort of figure out what was going on with our windows and doors. And he has particularly this image, which I will refer to later in this tutorial a couple times, which is really helpful illustration of the points A and B as they appear in Blender, and then as they're entered into Sims 4 Studio, and then how those points make up the corresponding edges. So we will talk about that in due course, but before we start with an example, I thought I might just talk about some of the basic components of a cutout now with the new system, just so you can learn the sort of fundamental principles first. So the way things used to work, long story short, the game used to use images to figure out what was cut out and what was not. So everything that was black was kept in, was the wall, and then everything that was deleted from that black was the cutout. So quite literally cut out. The way it works now, however, is through coordinates. So through looking at the mesh and saying, okay, from this point to this point to this point to this point is now where I don't want there to be wall. So it's slightly more complicated, and it can be a bit daunting for people who aren't numbers oriented, but don't stress. It doesn't involve any complicated maths or anything. Really, it doesn't involve any maths at all. It just involves being able to do the steps that I'll show you, which are simple and pretty straightforward. Once you've done it a couple times, you'll find it's actually not that hard. Another thing that I thought I might add is that there's really two fundamental parts of a cutout to keep in mind. And the first one is the cutout itself. In addition to the cutout itself, there's what I call the boundary. And these are the coordinates of a rectangle, as you can see, which encompasses the total area of where your cutout is. So by putting these coordinates in, you're effectively telling the game, okay, the cutout that I want is within the parameters of this frame that I'm drawing for you. And it therefore uses the highest high, lowest low, farthest left, farthest right of the coordinates, which you can derive yourself, and it's easy. I'll show you how. So that's just something to keep in mind. Everything has both of these. The first four coordinates, or first four edges with the coordinates in, are going to be your bounds. And that's the same for every window and door, no matter what shape it is. And then once you have those four put in, then you put in the coordinates for your cutout. If it's a rectangle or a square, as we will find, it's the same. As you can see, the cutout is the same as the bound. That's really handy and great, because then you can just copy over what you've entered for the bound, and bam, you've got a cutout as well. So let us begin. I'm going to open up an example for you here. This is a door, and all my examples in this tutorial are from Mutsuge, who I think is a really fantastic designer and has a lot of different shapes and sizes to make this as varied and educational as possible. So we've got this door here. As you can see, it's rectangular. It's a pretty standard door. The first thing that you want to do once you open up the Sims 4 Studio file is go to Meshes here and then press Export Mesh. You don't have to name it anything special. I just tend to override them anyway as I go. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open in Blender this file that we've saved. Now, Blender 2.79b is the most recent version of Blender that works with Sim 4 Studio. And it's free to download, comes on PC and Mac and Linux. And if you want to download it, I've got the links below. Don't stress at all when you open this and you go, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. Because when I first saw Blender, I was super intimidated. But it's actually not too bad. For our purposes, we're really going to use like 1% of what Blender has to offer in terms of functionality. So really don't stress. I thought I might incorporate like a little mini Blender tutorial about navigating and moving around, just because that'll save you the heartache of then having to go find a more comprehensive tutorial, which includes a lot of stuff that you don't need and is long and daunting. So let's go over this quickly. If you're someone who's used Blender quite a bit and you're really familiar with it, good on you. Like, honestly, feel free to skip ahead. This part is just for the noobs like myself who, when they started using Blender, freaked out a little bit. Also, I might add that the way I find these coordinates is not super elegant. It's not by way of making a plane or using vertices or doing anything fancy. It's pretty just easy, straightforward for the average Joe who doesn't make items. So in Blender, the most important key for this whole exercise, I think, is the N key. Now, N opens up this panel, which has, if you scroll towards the middle, this 3D cursor box. And as you'll note, there's an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate. At the moment, they're all set to 0 because it's sitting at 0. So this lovely circle with the crosshair thing is your 3D cursor. And if you click different spots, you move the cursor around. As you can see, moving the cursor to a different spot changes its coordinates because it's showing us what the cursor is touching. So once you've got those coordinates up, it's actually really easy to then just click around to where you think you want your edges to be on the mesh, or if you've got something more complicated, you can use a visual aid of the grease pencil just to make sure all your little edges are staying within the bounds of the cutout, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Firstly, basic Blender shortcuts. If you have a number pad, and don't worry if you don't, there is a way to get around this. Press 1, which is my most common view, which is just a straight front view. If you hold down Control and press 1, you'll get a back view, which actually does come in handy because sometimes the mesh will be different in the front than the back, which I will discuss in a little bit. So if you go back, you press 1, that takes you to the front. Alternatively, you've got 4, which rotates the view of the mesh. If you've got 6 as well, which rotates it in the other direction. And finally, I find it quite helpful to use this button, and this is 5 on the number pad, and 5 switches your view between a perspective view and an orthogonal view. So basically what orthogonal means is that it's flat. Everything is, the perspective isn't taken into account. And I actually find this view more helpful because you can see the absolute bounds of things. You don't have to be confused by the way things look based on like vanishing points and 3D sides and whatnot. Like I'll show you, for example, if you scroll in, and scroll, by the way, is either the middle mouse scroll button if you have a mouse, or if you don't, it's holding Control and swiping up and down on your trackpad. you zoom in on this, you can see that, your view of where this edge lies is kind of confusing because, you've got this little shadow, so you can kind of figure it out. But, you don't want to think that the cutout might go here rather than here. So if you switch to orthogonal view, that problem is gone. You just have the absolute bounds of where the cutout buffer, as I call it, exists on the object. Another helpful thing, of course, is to pan up and down. Now you do this by either holding shift and going up and down on the track pad or the middle wheel of your mouse. So similar concept to zooming in and out. If you have a mouse and you want to pan from side to side, you use control and you roll the middle scroll wheel. Alternatively, you can move your fingers in and out on your trackpad as if you're zooming in and zooming out to move left and right. Now, if you don't have a number pad, like I mentioned before, the way that you fix this and make sure that you can get the functions that you need is to go to user preferences here. And if you go to the input tab, there's this tick box, emulate numpad here. Just tick that, and that's basically just allows you to use your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys in lieu of a number pad. So it just treats that as a number pad. Also, incidentally, if you're that interested, you can change the key bindings for pretty much all the functions. I really just don't want to touch anything, but if that's what you're into, it's super customizable. Okay, so I think that's probably enough Blender. So looking at our door here, like I mentioned before, this is kind of what I consider the buffer, and we'll switch back to perspective mode just to sort of get a feel for it. So when we look at our mesh, this white part that sticks out, that's the part that's going to be coming through the wall, and then everything inside of that we want to cut out. Now, the lucky thing for us is that this is a pretty decent sized buffer. It's it's not huge, but there are some meshes that have really, really tiny little frames. And that means that your margin of error with respect to where the cutout is positioned is a lot smaller, and you have to use more decimal places and be more exact with your coordinates. Swapping back to orthogonal mode, we have here our door, and we want to find the four corners of the door since it is a rectangle. It's pretty safe to say that if it's a door, it's going to have a lower bound, which is this bottom edge here at 0. I don't think I've seen any that go underground, but I don't know, maybe they exist. This is also symmetrical, as most meshes tend to be, though not all. But your standard windows and doors, especially if they're rectangular, they will be symmetrical across this vertical line, which is your 0 x coordinate. Now, the one thing that might be confusing to people who are used to x and y coordinates in maths is that y here actually refers to the position of the door in a forward or backwards manner, which is completely irrelevant for our purposes because cutouts are just flat. So cutouts exist on the last coordinate, as we'll see, being a 0. So y basically just completely ignore. It's z that controls the elevation. So how high your bound is, low your bound is, and x is your left and right. Anything left of this 0 line, as you can see, will be negative. Anything right will be positive. Now, the helpful thing about having a symmetrical mesh like this one means that you only really need 2 coordinates because since you're reflecting them across this, well, I usually would think of it as the y-axis, but let's call it just the 0 axis. You then just have to change the negative sign to a positive sign or the positive sign to a negative sign when you input the coordinates. And that's the only difference. So you only have to do half the work, which is actually a godsend when you're doing a really complicated one and it has a bunch of little lines like a big circle or something. So let's quickly just gather up the numbers that we need. So this corner here, we know that the lower bound is 0, but let's figure out where we have to be on the x-axis. Now, there's no magic to this. I tend to just kind of click in the middle of the buffer area, and it looks like it's negative 0.4. Since this is symmetrical, we know that the other side is going to be positive 0.4 or thereabouts. And then the top looks like it's, let's say 2.23. So we've got our coordinates. Now you can either write them down, or you can open a notepad document, or you can just remember them. Once we've got that, we don't need our mesh anymore. We can close Blender, and instead now we go to Sims 4 Studio. So you're going to click on the Warehouse tab. Now, where all these coordinates live in the package file is something called a model cutout. If you scroll down and look and don't find a model cutout line, that's okay. That just means that one hasn't been created. So there hasn't been anyone attempting a fix of this custom content per se. If you are downloading a custom content that is maybe fixed by TSR and you want to say correct some of the coordinates, you will find that there will be model cutout already there, and then you just open it up and edit it. So it saved you a step. But in any event, this is how you create it. It's really easy. So click on model. There'll be 1 or 2 models depending on whether there's a diagonal mesh. Most times there's not. We'll talk about how to spot when there is. So you just have this one model. And by clicking on it, you automatically hover over this instance. So this instance number is imported into the model cutout resource. So the way this works is you just press add and you scroll down on your scroll menu to model cutout resource between model and model LOD. So as you can see, the instance is automatically populated and it's the same as the model. So you press OK and you scroll down to where your new little line is. And really important detail is you always want to make sure there is a 1 in the version. If it's all zeros, it's not going to work. So just try to maintain the habit of making sure that there's a 1 there. So in this case, we're going to edit our items, and because it's new, we've just created the model cutout, there's nothing there. So we press add. And this is a process that I use for everything, is I always first think, okay, what are the coordinates of my boundary? And in this case, like I said, it's a rectangle. The boundary and the cutout are the same. But when we do some examples later, you'll see that that's not always the case. So this is super easy because all you need is 4 and then you just copy them. So in this case, let's enter in our coordinates. This coordinate entry bit I know has been a source of some strife for people because it can be a bit confusing. So I thought I would just show you the fundamentals behind how these coordinates work. And there's really only one thing that you need to know. And that rule is that you must enter the coordinates with coordinate A towards coordinate B being in a counterclockwise direction. So what I mean by this is if you start at A and then you go to B and you keep moving in that direction and just assume your shape is a circle, then you should be going counterclockwise. Basically what this means is when you have a rectangle, your A in the bottom left-hand corner will be the A that goes to B in the bottom right-hand corner, and your A will then be the bottom right-hand corner up to the top right-hand corner, and so on and so forth. If you input these backwards, you will get an inverted cutout, which cuts out the wall everywhere and only puts a wall on your window, which is the exact opposite of what you want. So if this ever happens to you, you've probably reversed the order. Just always remember that if you are traveling with your finger or cursor around from point A to point B, you should be going counterclockwise. So the edges can be entered as SimGuy80 put in his diagram. So you can put edge 1 in being the left and then the top and then the right and then the bottom, or as I prefer, and I'll talk about why, you can start with the bottom and then go to the right and then the top and then the left. There really doesn't matter. You can actually do them in any order. It could be completely random. All that matters, and I'll say this again, is that your A in relation to your B is moving in a counterclockwise direction. I'm going to show you what I do because I like the fact that when you go starting from the bottom left-hand corner, go towards the right side, I find that that's a bit more elegant because you can start, your point A becomes your point B in the next one. So effectively, you're saying, okay, we're starting at this point, we're going to this point. And then once you're at that point, you say, okay, we're at this point, we're going to this point. Okay, we're at this point, we're going to this point. And that's kind of how it connects it in my mind. And also one thing that's really handy about this way of doing it is that your first point A and your last point B will be the same if you've done it correctly. So it's basically forming the little loop. And that's a really easy way to check, even if you have 50 edges, check the first, check the last. If A in the first and B in the last are the same, then it's probably okay. And hopefully it will come out just like you want it to. So if we apply that method, we're going to start in the bottom left-hand corner. So that's negative 0.4, as we said, and 0 because it's a door. It's bounded by the ground. And then we're going to move over to complete the bottom. So moving counterclockwise takes us towards the positive 0.400 coordinate in the bottom right-hand corner. And then continuing, so this is a really easy way of doing it. If you copy and paste the previous B into the next A, it's super easy way of keeping track of which way you're going and what coordinates you've reached so you don't leave anything out. So we've gone from negative 4.4 to positive 0.4, and now we're at positive 0.4, and our next place we're going is now we're going up to make that right side. So we've got positive 0.4, and we decided 2.23 was the height of the top bound, and we put our 0 in. Okay, so now just gonna copy that and put that there. And we're now going to make the top. So this is the top right, and now we need to go to the top left. And helpfully enough, the top left is just this, but in the negative direction. So we can just add a negative sign and copy paste that again. And finally, we're going to copy paste this one, put it back in A, and we're going to complete our square by finishing our left side on the bottom left-hand side. So we're going to put in negative 0.400, and let's do our double check. Our first A, negative 0.400, and our last is negative 0.400. Yay! This last coordinate, which is a 0, this is irrelevant. This is what would be the Y coordinate that I showed you in Blender. It's unnecessary to have anything other than 0 because windows and doors sit flat on the surface of the plane of a wall. I'd really hope EA doesn't do anything that involves 3D cutouts or some craziness because I might just lose my mind. Don't want to give them any ideas. So just long story short, the first two matter, the last one's a 0. So we've got our bounds in here for this door, and since it's a rectangle, easy peasy, you just select all of it and make sure that you select it all because you want to copy everything once. You don't want to copy, say, 2 of the first one and 1 of the second and not the third or anything, otherwise you're going to get some weirdness. So you highlight all 4 and you press copy and then save and then save. And it's as easy as that. You've got a cutout. So obviously you're going to test it in game, of course, but one thing I might show you while I'm on the screen is the export button. If you have a cutout that is a pretty common size and you've got a lot of variations of windows or doors that share the same cutout size, it streamlines the process even more if you use the export. So what I've done with export is, I'll just call it 1 because I'm creative, is I've saved the coordinates that I just input into its own little document, and then I can import that into an empty model cutout resource. So let's pretend like I just created this, and we're going to press clear, which is just what you do if you download this and it already has some numbers there and they're not right. Just press clear, get rid of it, make it brand new. And version 0, like I just created it. Now, if you import this 1.binary, you'll notice that helpfully it changes the version number to what the exported version was. So that's one less thing to freak out about. And if you go to edit items, you'll see that all 8 of our coordinates are here like we had them. So that is that with a basic rectangle. Let's save our package and move on to something a little bit more complicated. Once you have the basics, then like I said, it's just really applying it. So let's move to the arch, Mutske's London Arch. As you can see, this one has a little round top, so obviously a straight rectangular cutout is not going to work. So if we go to our meshes and we export the mesh, and we'll just overwrite this one, you don't really need to refer back generally to previous Blender files, so you're safe just overriding them. So we're going to go back, we're going to press 1, I'm going to press N to open up our navigation pane, and we're going to zoom in a little. So in this case, we have something that's going to require more than 4 sides, obviously, because it's a bit more complicated than a rectangle. The way I do this sort of non-rectangular stuff is basically just by sort of guesstimating where would be the best places to have a point and then have a line. Now, the way that I help visualize to make sure that I'm connecting my lines in a way that isn't going to be inside the bounds of the cutout or outside where it needs to be is something called the grease pencil. This is basically just a drawing tool in Blender, and I find it really helpful when you're trying to figure out how to do basically like tangent lines around a curve. So the function that I like the best is this poly one. Poly is basically like if you use Photoshop, it's like your free polygon select tool. Like it's basically you just click and then you click another point and it connects them a line. So one thing that is helpful about the grease pencil is you can change the color. You just click on this stroke and then you lighten it up. You can make it any color you want. This can be helpful because, like, if you can see this texture on this mesh, it's dark. If black grease pencil wouldn't be too easy to see, but that's just my personal opinion. I would also recommend that you keep the texture. You've got different view modes here. Keep texture on. That way you can actually see the different colors and how it's meant to work. It can give you a little bit of signposting as to what's meant to be cut out and what's not. So in this case, we're going to start the process the same way we did with the other door mesh. And we know that 0 is our lower side because it is a door. And so what we're going to do is we're going to move up to the point where we think we want to sort of start our arch. And this is all just eyeballing it. And let's zoom in and go up a little bit. And it looks like you have to, by the way, you have to scroll down a little bit to get to your 3D cursor panel. When you have the grease pencil open, it just pushes it down. So don't freak out. So here we see, it looks like it's around, I'd say about -4, like 0.4 rather, like our previous one. I'm just going to open up Notepad and we'll put the coordinates in here because there are a few more to remember. I'm just going to resize this window. Cool. So we have our first coordinate here. We also have, of course, 0, which is implicitly the bottom left-hand corner. So we might as well just put that in, and we've got -0.4, and this is, let's say, 2.58. If you're ever unsure about which way you should round or you want to check something, you can actually type in the coordinate here. So this is 2.58. And this is -0.4, so this shows exactly where that spot is. So I can make sure, for example, like if I think, 2.6 sounds close enough, and I put that in, okay, yeah, it is, but what about 2.63? No, it's clearly outside the area. So that's a really good way of just double checking if you're unsure about the best coordinates. So as you can see, we've got our top left hand before the arch starts. So just select poly and click sort of somewhere in the middle of those cursors. Doesn't have to be perfect. You're just using this as a visual guide, like I said. And then say about here. So as you can see, this is inside the bounds of the buffer, which is exactly what you want. It's not obviously a perfect arch, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, because you won't see any of this. In fact, it's actually better at this point if it's not. Firstly, you have less coordinates to input, so it's a lot less time consuming. But also, because of a quirk in the current new system, there's these little weird crack artifact things that appear whenever there's a certain number of these tangent lines that are put in. It happens on EA's meshes as well. It's something EA is going to have to fix, so don't freak out. It's not your fault. Sometimes if you have a really narrow frame and a really big, say, circle, you really don't have any option. You have to use a lot of little tangent lines to make it fit within the narrow boundary, and that's fine. You know, you do what you need to do, but at this point, until EA fixes the artifact problem, I just, as a rule of thumb, think, okay, how can I do as few different lines as possible and still fit within the boundaries of our buffer frame? So since this is a symmetrical mesh, like we did with the other door, I don't need to plot out any points on this side because I know that it's just going to be the same Z, since it's the same height, but the opposite x. So instead of negative 0.4, this would be 0.4, it would be 2.58. So this should hopefully ring some bells back from algebra to people without too much PTSD. If you then click approximately around where your point is between these two little tangent lines you've created, you can then find that coordinate. Like I said, just a visual guide. You can kind of tweak it. It doesn't have to be perfect. In this case, let's say it's 0.23 and we'll call it 2.69. And then finally it takes us to the middle, which is 0 as the center x coordinate, and let's say 2.72 as the z coordinate for our upper bound. So that is that. We can quit because we've got these things jotted down. And now we're going to go into our warehouse, which we did previously. So it's the same process. In this case, there is already a model cutout because I created one. Let's just get rid of the stuff in there. So as you can see, now we're starting from a blank slate. So first things first, you want your first 4 edges of your boundary rectangle. Now, this is not going to be the same, of course, as the cutout because the cutout is slightly curved and the rectangle is not. But the way that you find the coordinates for your rectangle is just by looking at your coordinates that you've written down and figuring out, okay, what is the lowest negative x coordinate and the highest positive x coordinate. So basically, what is the farthest it goes left? What is the farthest it goes right? What is the smallest z coordinate, which is usually 0 will be the smallest you'll see because I don't think windows generally go below ground. And then what is the top bound? So what is the highest of the z coordinates? And it's just from looking at this that you can figure it out. Since this is symmetrical, we know that negative 0.4 and positive 0.4 are the x coordinates that correspond to this z coordinate. So let's make firstly our rectangles. Let's start in the bottom left-hand corner, and we've got negative 0.400 as we did previously. And we're going to follow the same thing. We're going to move over to complete our bottom side. And then we're going to take our point B and make it the next one's point A to show that we've gone to there. And now we're moving from there to the next place. Next place, of course, is going to be the top right corner, which is now you see there's multiple Z values here, but since you want the top, you want the highest bound, so the greatest number, which is 2.72. So we put that in as our top bound and copy it and paste that. So that's top right again. And we're now going over to form the top edge. So we're going to put negative 4, 2.72 in, and finally, we are going to close the rectangle by going back down to negative 0.400. So with these coordinates in, you've done the first step. Unfortunately, you can't just copy them all and be done with it with this. You have to create more edges. In this case, there's 7, but don't stress. If you don't know how many edges you're going to need, feel free to make a whole bunch. And let's say, this is the last one you need. You just remove, and get down to the number that you need. So we've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So let's start with our first edge, and it's the same process. We start in the bottom left-hand corner, and that's our -4.00. And this time we're actually using these coordinates. So if we start there, we're going to go +400 because we're traveling to make that bottom side. And now we want to go up, and up takes us from 0.400 to the first of our 0.4 coordinates. This is 2.580. And if you can sort of picture it, we're moving up, and then we're going to start moving in and towards the left. And that's creating our little arch shape. So we put that there. We look at our next coordinate, so that's positive on this side, 0.23, 2.690. And we're going to take that coordinate, and we're going to paste it there, and we're going to then move to our midpoint, which is 2.72. And then we're going to copy that and just basically keep going on. So now since it's reflected across, we just put -2.3, 2.69, because now we're starting to move down a little. So we're going around the other side of the arch, and we put it in like that, and then we put in -0.4, 2.580, and finally we go back to just the starting point. So double check. I'm going to look at my first edge of this shape. This shape, of course, starts here because this is your rectangle, which you always have no matter what shape you're cutting out. And I look at my point A and I say, okay, this is -0.400. Fantastic. This is my point B, my last one, -0.400. Great. And then you save it, and you are done. So it's hopefully, as you can see, a really straightforward process. You get pretty used to how it works, and sometimes you have to test things and they don't quite work the way you were hoping in game, and you learn really quickly how to fix wonky stuff that happens. So I'm just going to take you to look at this oval. So this is, closer to a circular shape. It's ovular. It's the same process. It might look daunting at first. I promise it's not. Look at your oval. I've already exported the mesh. And you're going to press 1, press N, zoom in and pan up. And it's just the same process. Except here, because it's an oval in symmetrical across the 0 axis, I just make the coordinates for one side, and then like we did before, you just change this negative sign to be positive or positive to be negative if you do this side. So we open our grease pencil and just kind of draw. Oh, I don't like that one. And same thing, I'm trying to use as few points as possible. Like it's not particularly elegant, but as long as it's within the boundaries here, it will be covered up because this is going to sit behind this lovely window frame and you won't see this cutout. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is 5. So we've got 10 sides in this case, which you would import into, let's quit that. You get all those coordinates, of course, but then you would import that into your model cutout here, which I've already done. So as you can see, there's 4. So here's your bounds of your rectangle, and then 10 for that circle. And you just put them in there, and it's easy as that. This is a triangle. I will show you if you go to this model cutout. So the first 4 are your rectangle that encompasses the bounds, And then here's your farthest left, bottom left point. This is your bottom right point that creates the bottom of the triangle. Then that's your bottom right to your top right, and that's the other leg of the triangle. And then the top right to the bottom left is the hypotenuse. So that hopefully makes it pretty clear what those points mean. I will show you this final example of sort of odd cutouts because I think it's important to keep this in mind. So this shape, it's lovely, it's really cool, it's Art Deco. You look at this, you think, oh, I've got like plenty of cutout room. Look at all this allowance I have. Well, if you open it up in Blender, and this is why I thought it would be important to tell you how to look at the back of the mesh, you will find that if you press Control 1 and look at the back, oh, the back is very different. And that's because this is the outdoor bit, this is the indoor bit. And therefore, if you don't follow this smaller indoor cutout, which is narrower and needs to be more precise, it will look really weird from one side. It may look fine from the outside, but then when you turn around, you're going to have cutouts where there shouldn't be cutouts. So just something to keep in mind. Not all windows are like this. Some are symmetrical back to front. It just really depends on the build set and the style of it. But it's always worth having a look in case you're not sure. So that is another thing. Now I'm going to close this out and we'll quickly talk about what you do when you have more than one shape. And the answer is the same thing you did previously. So here we've got two cutout shapes, in this case in one mesh. And if you go back to what we learned about the two components of the mesh, we've got first our boundary. And the boundary is the total area that encompasses the cutout and then the cutout itself. So if we go to the warehouse and we find our model cutout, now this one, which I've done already, you can see the first four are the total boundaries. So this is the farthest left X, and because it's symmetrical, the positive version will be the farthest right X. This is the farthest top coordinate, and this is the lowest coordinate. So that's there like it is for everything. And then this is the lower one, the one on the bottom. So you can see slightly different coordinates because this one starts from the bottom, but its bound is only 2.8 because it doesn't go all the way up, because then there's a space and then there's another top rectangle. And then the last four of these edges are the ones for the second upper rectangle. So all you need to do if you have multiple shapes is just input one and then input the other and keep going and going. The most important thing, like I said, is remember that that you should be going counterclockwise to get from A to B. And secondly, it's important that you always have a loop. So in the sense that your first starting coordinate eventually swings back around to it. Now, if you go following the method I showed you, the last B and the first A will be the same. If you alternatively travel along the edges a different direction, like the one that SimGuy80 used, then in this case, you'll find that it's the first B and the last A that are the same. Doesn't matter in any event. You just want to make sure there's that closing of the loop. So finally, I wanted to show you in the event that you have a mesh with a diagonal, you look here at your meshes and when you go to export it, you'll think, oh, gee, what is that one in brackets? And you'll notice, oh, there's a 2. Now, this is because this object has another mesh for when it's placed on a diagonal wall. And this is usually going to be the case for windows that are meant to either take up the whole wall, like a greenhouse, it's meant to be seamless, like you're not supposed to see little bits of wall in between. So if you click on this, like for instance, you can actually see it's a different size. It's a bit wider. The reason for this, of course, is because going back to our beloved geometry, if you have a triangle and this, it's called just the normal side. This normal side is one leg of the triangle and the other leg of the triangle, and it's a right triangle. Then this side is your hypotenuse, and your hypotenuse is always going to be bigger than your individual side length. You can use Pythagorean theorem to find out what this hypotenuse width is relative to your normal width, but I'm not super into math, so I find it easiest just to do the following. So you go to your one, export mesh, and we can just replace that one. And you go to number 2, let's call it D for diagonal. And we export that. And then when we go into Blender, open up both of them so you can see. You just need to take the coordinates. We'll start with the normal one. Just need to go in and find these coordinates. And in this case, we've got, bottom is roughly 1.23, 2.81 is the top, and the sides are 4.475 or thereabouts. The only things that will differ in the diagonal is just the width. So these two coordinates, so that the Z coordinates stay the same, but the X will change slightly. And we'll see that because now if we look at our diagonal mesh, let me zoom in, the sides here, this is 0.67 instead of 0.47, and yet we've got the same lower upper bounds, so it's just the width that's changed. Cool, so once we write those numbers down, then we enter it into the warehouse, and if there isn't already model cutouts, which there are because I've done this already, and I'm just going to delete them, then the way that you create them is you click on your first model and do exactly what we learned to do the first time, and then you do it again for the second model. If you have 3D preview on, you can see which is which. Obviously the wider one is the diagonal. Generally speaking, they're going to be in this order of the first one in the list is going to be the normal cutout, and then the second one will be the diagonal. So we're just going to do what we did previously, model cutout resource, and click OK. And then we're going to go to this model, and as you can see, the instance number is slightly different than this instance number, so you're not trying to generate two of the same file, and so that's quite important. So because we've got this second one now clicked on, it will automatically generate its own instance number here. Model cutout resource automatically comes up the second time, which is very helpful. And now we go down to our model cutouts. So you would just edit your items here or import them if you already have them saved, and do the same here for the diagonal. And then once that's done, you can test it by going into your game and putting it on a straight wall and then putting on a diagonal wall. And if the cutout matches both of the meshes, then you've done it correctly. So, man, I know that was a lot to go through, and I'm sure you're probably a bit information overload at the moment. I figured the easiest thing to do is just dive in, start doing it, give it a try, find out what works best for you, but always test them, because sometimes, especially when you get tired and you're robotically putting things in, it's really easy to make a little mistake, and I do all the time. So that is the tutorial. I really hope that that was helpful. Please, if you have any questions, either comment on this video or contact me on any of my social media. As I said, when the new batch fix comes out, this will probably be obsolete, but I think it's still a helpful thing to understand, especially if you do want to make objects. So thank you so much, everybody. Stay well and safe, and happy simming.